Neal Battaglia, saxstation.com. I wanted to talk about pitches on the saxophone and pitches in general in music. One thing you might have noticed is that, say you're in a house and someone's playing music in a different room in the house. You're not necessarily going to hear the high frequencies very well. Maybe you will, but they'll probably be kind of muffled. What's probably going to come through to you, if you're separated by walls and everything, is the bass. Bass travels farther than high frequencies do. And my background in school actually is in physics. I studied physics, then applied physics. So I learned a little bit about acoustics. And one thing you learn even like a pretty early level course for physics is that lower frequencies also have a corresponding higher wavelength. What you have with like both light and sound is the wavelength and the frequency. And these things kind of, one's high, one's low, or they're both in the middle. So if you have a low frequency, then you're going to have a high wavelength. If you have a high frequency, you're going to have a smaller wavelength. The wavelength is something with size. So it's a compression wave in the air, but it has a size to the wavelength, so centimeters, meters, etc. So if something has a big wavelength, maybe it's in the order of like meters or tens of meters or even bigger, you can really have any frequency you think about. We just can't hear any frequency that you can think about. We can hear from about 20 hertz to about 20,000 hertz. And kind of depending on your lifestyle, what you do, how much loud music you hear without protection, you can lose some frequencies in your ear. So you kind of start to lose the low end and start to lose the high end. So you might go down from like 20,000 hertz to 19,000 hertz, and you might go from 20 hertz, maybe you can't hear that anymore, maybe go up to like 30 or something. It depends on what exactly you do. I do recommend being pretty careful with your ears, because once you lose hearing, it doesn't come back. It doesn't like regenerate. So like when I play music in loud settings, like if I'm right next to the drums or the timbales, specific kind of drum and loud music, which are very loud. I would say louder than the congas, louder than the bongos. The bell can be very loud too. A guira can be super loud. And if you're near these things, or even just speakers where the music is loud and there's no live music, you want to be careful. With earplugs, like foam earplugs, they do kind of change what you hear. So sometimes it's not as musically useful to have them in. But at the same time, if that's all you have and you want to protect your hearing and you're exposed to this a lot of times, you might want to do that. You can also get custom earplugs, which have a little bit more even distribution of how they dampen the sounds, so it sounds more like the music would sound without the earplugs. So I'd look into that. If you're playing, you need to be able to hear well. If you're just listening, you might kind of not hear quite as well with the earplugs, but you can protect your hearing for the future. Something I would recommend keeping in mind. But back to wavelength and the frequencies. So basically, if you have a high frequency, you have a smaller wavelength. So let's imagine the wavelength was this big, so maybe a few centimeters. A few centimeters, that actually interacts with something like the size of the saxophone. So basically, if the wavelength is going to interact with objects, it can get absorbed by objects. What happens if the wavelength is longer? If the wavelength is longer, then basically this is significantly bigger than this section of the saxophone. It ends up just going around the object and it doesn't get absorbed. If it doesn't get absorbed, it can go through things and around things. So basically these low frequency, long wavelengths can travel farther. And one thing you see in nature actually is that elephants with a pretty low pitch can communicate over very long distances, because basically the long wavelength is going to go around things like trees and grass and rocks and things like that, whatever's in their environment. And it can travel and be heard at a long distance. Elephants also can hear pretty well, but they can send this low frequency, which is able to actually go through the environment in a way that doesn't dampen it, doesn't get absorbed by all the objects that are around it. Even more than that are blue whales. Blue whales are the largest mammal that live, and there are these huge whales underwater, and you might have kind of noticed, like even with the saxophones, the larger saxophones can play lower frequencies. Whales, which are enormous, especially blue whales, the biggest whale, they can emit very low frequencies, which have a very long wavelength, they can actually, and they're also in water, which changes the situation a little bit more. But basically, it's low frequencies, long wavelength in water, which is a different medium. That sound can travel across the world. So blue whales can communicate basically without wires or anything that humans use, but they can use this low frequency to communicate. And also, that's kind of why you hear the bass from farther away. So, say like there's a concert happening, even like miles or kilometers away, you might be able to hear the bass more than you hear any of the other frequencies because basically the bass can travel around objects, not get absorbed, and make it to your ears so you can hear it.